For those following along in our Cedar Ream, our prayer books, we will begin on page 128 in the brackets, in the book if you have brackets, and our regular page 128 if you have no brackets. It's page 128. Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Mishoch avdecha, Eretzonecha, Mishoch avdecha, Yadadadadadai, Eretzonecha. 128. Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Mishoch avdecha, Eretzonecha, Mishoch avdecha, Yadadadadadai, Eretzonecha. Yarut avdecha kemaya, yishtachaveh el muadarecha. Again, page 128 if you're following along. Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Mishoch avdecha, Eretzonecha, Mishoch avdecha, Eretzonecha. Yarut avdecha kemaya, yishtachaveh el muadarecha. Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Yedid nefesh avarachaman, Mishoch avdecha, Eretzonecha, Mishoch avdecha, Yadadadadai, Eretzonecha. Yarut avdecha kemaya, yishtachaveh el muadarecha. Yishtachaveh el muadarecha.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
There has been so much hubbub in this space. It's so wonderful. This was like, cannot hear me. Cannot hear me. We're going to increase this a little bit. Can you hear me now? There has been so much sharing and energy and talking and connecting, and it's so good. It's what we want to see on Shabbat. And now I'm going to ask you to help us bring you into a little bit different of a mood. We're going to get back there. We're going to get back to just like enjoying each other's company and talking and connecting and all that. But now we're going to enter this beautiful sanctuary. And this beautiful sanctuary, but this other beautiful sanctuary, which is not just about space, but it's also about time. We have stepped over the threshold from the work week, which is full of all the doing, all the fixing and making and replying and responding and just making things happen, fulfilling deadlines, checking things off the list, rushing and running and traveling, and we're going to breathe a little differently. We're going to remember, like, we're not just defined by how much we can get done in an hour or how many emails there are in our inbox. Is anybody here an inbox zero person? Oh my gosh. Okay. And then there's some people who have like 7,000 in their inbox. Is that you? Somebody like that? But that is actually not the measure of who you are. It is not. It's neither a measure. It's neither a measure of how popular you are. I mean, maybe it is, but not really. Nor is it a measure of how efficient you are. Like, it's just not actually a measure of who you are. Right? So then actually, if we put all that stuff down, we get to kind of say, okay, well, actually, who am I really? And what actually matters in my life if it's not the inbox? And that's the invitation, that's the threshold we are stepping across right now. And it includes exuberance and joy and volume, definitely. But it also includes quietude and deep breathing and remembering, there's something bigger going on here. That's the invitation of Kabbalat Shabbat. So come on in. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be singing these psalms that the Kabbalists identified long ago to say to us, you need a bridge. You can't just flip I was flipping the switch in there. You can't just flip the switch. It's not like that. You need a bridge. It's been a big week. Always. It's been a busy week. Maybe it's been a hard week. It's been a week. And now something different is invited to happen, or we're inviting it into us, or we're invited into it. We need a transition. The transition is called Kabbalat Shabbat. It is these psalms. They are loud. They are joyous. They are about singing and clapping, and they are about rejoicing about God, which you could think of as God, or you could think of as like the interconnectedness of all being, or you could think about belonging to something bigger than yourself. You could translate it however you want, but gratitude. You could just think, what right now am I actually truly grateful for? Not the list of things I'm supposed to say I'm grateful for, but what am I actually grateful for this evening? You could use this time for that. But we're going to sing together to get us across the bridge into a different kind of consciousness, and that's Shabbat. Then we're going to have Mariv, our regular evening prayers, have a chance to kind of touch into things we might be longing for, grateful for, awed by. And then we're going to have a chance to shift gears again and hear from our travelers. And I'll say more when we get there. So for now, we are turning to page 130. Lechu neranana. Come, let us sing out in joy.
Lechu Kadma
Page 137, the final two lines on the page. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain, Adonai yivarech et amo. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain, Adonai yivarech et amo. Adonai yivarech et amo. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain, Adonai yivarech et amo. Shalom.
this moment, we take a pause to breathe in, really enjoy the company, the fullness of the space, the fullness of our voices. We are here to welcome in Shabbat. And that requires just the kind of call that we just had together, that joy, that simcha emanating out when we bring our voices together. I'm just really enjoying the fact that there's a lot of voices here tonight. And so as we get to Lecha Dodi next, let's take a moment to think about how we are welcoming in something together and what we're really welcoming in our open doors. What can we welcome in together?
Please rise. Boi
standing and turn to page 144. Shemei Rabbah, Be'amad Yivrach Yeruteh, V'yamlich Malchuteh, B'chayechon u'v'yamechon, u'chayetecho Beit Yisrael, Ba'gala, Ba'gala, u'v'zman kariv, V'imiru Ameh, Yehei Shmei Yibarach v'yishtabach, Yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yinaseh, v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalo, Shemei dekudasha b'richu, le'ela min kol mirchata v'shirata, tushmechata v'nechemata, da'ami Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu HaMa'ori Shemir HaMa'ori Bati Asharim, Yuna Mishaneitim, Machali, Arasmanim, Sadet, Hakochavim, Vishmartehem, Markiak, Yutsono, Ureum Valala, Boleor, Mibne Choshech, Mechoshech, Mibne Or, Uma'avir Yom, Umevi Laila, Umavdil, Ben Yom, Ben Laila, Adonai, Tzevaot Shemo. El Chai v'Kayam, Tamid Yimloch Aleinu le'olam va'ed. Baruch Ata Adonai HaMa'oriv Aravi. Page 150. Ahavat Olam Beit Yisrael, Amcha ahavta, Torah u'mitzvot, chukim u'mishpatim, otanu limadeta, al kein Adonai Eloheinu, b'shochbeinu u'v'gvuleinu, nasiach b'chukecha, v'nismach b'divrei Toratecha, u'b'mitzvotecha le'olam va'ed, ki הם חיינו לאורך ימינו, ובהם נגן יומם ולילה, ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמי. Baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael, ohev amo Yisrael, ohev amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha b'chol me'od. 154. Ve'hayu ha'devarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibartam bam v'shivtecha b'feitecha u'v'lechtecha v'derech uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha u'kshartam le'ot ayadecha v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha u'chtavtam amezuzot beitecha u'visharecha lema'an tiskeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'yitem kedoshim lelohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem lelohim ani Adonai Elohechem Adonai Elohechem Amen.
Page 160, we come to Hashkivenu, our prayer in which we turn toward the idea of protection. So naturally, we call to mind all the people we're aware of in our world, the world, who need protection, whether that is shelter from the cold during the winter, or from the rain, or from the snow, or from the storms taking place in other parts of the country, the world, whether that is protection from war and violence, bombing and shelling, whether that's protection from hunger, other forms of suffering. So we've imagined that we could spread out this Sukkot Shalom, this shelter of peace, over all the vulnerable, that they would feel safe and be able to sleep at night, that we too would be able to sleep at night, knowing that everyone had what they need. We'll make that prayer, and then we're going to turn from there to Misha Berach, thinking about specific people who need healing. And I'm going to invite you, probably just by section, to call out names, people you're thinking about when we're in the middle of that prayer, and we'll fold all those names together into our prayer for healing. Right now, page 160, Hashkivenu.
Hashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, L'shalom v'hamidenu, Shomreinu l'chaim, Ufros aleinu לפניך, והושיענו למען שמך, להגן בעדנו, ועשה מעלינו אויב דבר, וחרב ורעב ויגון, והרחק ממנו עוון ופשע, ובצל כנפיך תסתירנו, כי אל שומרנו ומצילנו אתה, כי אל חנון ורחום אתה, ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל
Now page 371.
מי שברך אבותינו מקור הברכה לאמותינו, may the source of strength who bless the ones before us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen.
We pray for healing for the people we name now. Just in the entire section, you can just call out names. Go ahead in this section, you can just call out names. Over here. Holding them all together, we pray.
מי שברך אמותינו מקור הברכה לאבותינו, bless those in need of healing with refuah shelema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
We turn back now to page 162 for Vishamru. We're going to rise together, sing Vishamru together, and then go directly into a silent Amidah beginning on page 164.
Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et Shabbat vayinafash uvayom hashvi Shabbat vayinafash.
as I mentioned at the beginning of our service, and as you all know, this is the Friday night of a holiday weekend in America in which we celebrate the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And usually on the Friday night of this weekend, we do some kind of special thing. We often have invited members of the community, Black leaders in the community, whether clergy or elected officials, to speak to us. We have done service projects. And this year, we decided to do something different, and I have a feeling it's going to be what I'm going to want to do from now on, which is we have been having for years now a trip where we take our 9th graders to the South. And we fly down to Atlanta, and it's with a tour company that helps us really visit and reflect upon several sites that are really key to the history of the civil rights movement, and also that are created by the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And over the years, lots of parents of 9th graders have said to us, how come only the teenagers get to go on this trip? I want to go on this trip. And so this year, for I think the first time in CBE's history, we had an adult trip, the exact same itinerary, but for adults. And it was led by Rabbi Stephanie Colin, who is racing back here. Oh, is here. Is actually here. And is really the kind of point person on our clergy team for all of our social justice work. And there were how many people on the trip? 35. And if you were on this trip and are here in the room, and not, a lot of people couldn't be here tonight, but if you were on this trip, would you be willing to stand up so we can see who was there, who traveled? Yeah. Awesome. All right. You may be seated. And so, rather than hear from, not that we should never do this again, hear from a Black leader in the community, of course we should, but when we're thinking about racism in our country, and we're thinking about our relationship to it, our relationship to it is how we probably ought to reflect. And so having our own voices in deep reflection seems like a good way to spend this evening. And so we asked 4 of the travelers to speak from the heart about their experience of what they saw and what they learned, what they're thinking about now. And we could have asked all 35 to speak, and there are at least 35 different ways to speak about this, many more. And so I want to thank our speakers in advance for being willing to be the ones to share their voices. And I want to just say one more thing, which is that it also happens to be that this week in Torah, we begin the book of Exodus, which is a narrative that, of course, has been not only important to the Jewish people and shaped our entire identity, but has been really important in the African-American struggle for liberation. And so that's really meaningful. And this is where we find courage that happens by a number of people, and I'll say maybe a little bit more after our speakers, but where the conditions of slavery actually begin to turn in this parsha. There's going to take a bunch of parshiot to get there, but we see the first acts that turn the tide, and people engaging in civil disobedience, people engaging in acts of hope that seem to defy all likelihood of succeeding, and that's how change begins. So I am going to invite up our speakers. We'll go one at a time. We're going to start with Bobby Finkelstein, who's going to reflect a little bit. And after Bobby, we'll have Mick Van Bema, and then we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people from the trip and so many people from the DRT and so many old friends. So I had known about the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum for Equal Justice, for several years. It was a journey I knew I wanted to take. I was so excited when I heard that CBE was taking lots of us on that trip. So the trip did, though, fill me with some apprehension, especially the visit to the memorial. I knew it would be difficult to be in a physical space that marked the horror of lynching, but also felt it was important to bear witness to those acts of violence. When I entered the grounds, I could see the memorial in the distance on top of a hill, set against a very blue sky. The first thing one sees upon entering are words describing the history of Black people in this country. You also see a sculpture of Black men and women shackled and chained together with a look of pure terror on their faces from slavery. There are 2 other sculptures further along on the site, one dedicated to the women heroines of the Montgomery bus boycott, and one of men in a line imprisoned in a block of concrete. All you can see are their heads and raised, outstretched arms. To me, this was a statement against police brutality, mass incarceration, and that freedom was still beyond reach. When I started my journey through the memorial, I was overwhelmed by the enormity of the number of monuments. In front of me was a square site filled with 805 rectangular, rusted steel columns. Each one represented the counties where lynchings took place. On each were the names of the people from that county and the day they died. Some listed had no name other than unknown in capital letters. There were men, women, and children. Some counties had a few names, and some had more than 24. It was difficult to walk through what felt like a spiral maze of all these markers. At first, you are face to face with the columns, but as you continue, the path slopes downward, and the steel monuments are suspended above you. I felt like I was a witness to the lynchings. Reasons given for the lynchings were written on the wall, but there was no sense to be made out of any of it. That's when you realize that that's the point, to terrorize a group of people who had no way of knowing if a gesture, an omission, an act of citizenship like voting or registering to vote could lead you to be dragged out and lynched, often in public. It was domestic terrorism, as the narrative stated, the enforced racial hierarchy of white supremacy. There was no protection for anyone, for any of the Black people with our laws. I learned that 6 million people, Black people, between 1910 and 1970 fled the South and migrated to the North to escape the trauma of lynching. Towards the end of the path through the columns is a waterfall, a place of reflection and some respite from the pain and suffering we have journeyed through. These words were written above the waterfall, which I just recently rediscovered. Thousands of African Americans are unknown victims of racial terror lynching, whose deaths cannot be documented and whose names will never be known. They are all honored here. I knew I was in a sacred space. Just before our trip, I listened to a podcast where Clint Smith, a staff writer for The Atlantic and the author of How the Word is Passed, spoke about his cover story for the December issue, Monuments to the Unthinkable. Smith travels to Germany so he can understand that country's reckoning with the horror of the Holocaust. I read the full article on our bus ride to Montgomery. He discovers stolpersteins, stumbling stones, brass plates set into the street and engraved with the name, birthday, and final fate of people who were victims of the Nazis. Smith says, I imagined what it might be like if we had something like this in the United States, if in front of homes, restaurants, office buildings, churches, and schools, There were stones to mark where enslaved people had been held, sold, killed. Next to the hanging steel monuments at the Memorial for Peace and Justice are identical replicas lying on the ground. They remind one of coffins. These can be adopted by the county and placed in a public institution to encourage conversations, hopefully leading to a reconciliation with the past. We were told that as of our visit, 40 counties had chosen to place their column in a public space. I do believe that we can only move on when we have reconciled the history of our past. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and the force behind the Memorial and the Legacy Museum, remains hopeful despite the enormity of the injustice to Black people over centuries and continuing today. To paraphrase him, having hope is not a question. Hopelessness leads to an action. I have joined CBE's Dismantling Racism Team's Advocacy Working Group, which focuses on criminal justice reform. It is inspirational to see members of the coalitions we work with continue to fight for bills to reform the system, despite constant pushback from the powers that be. It is a struggle to keep hope alive as one keeps working on issues of social justice. I have no choice but to struggle on. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Rishakoa. Mick. And after Mick will be Justine Harris.
Good evening. Walking alone through the 800 haunting stone monoliths that hang at the center of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, it hit me that the lynchings they document extend to the decade in which I was born and counties in the north as well as the south. The feeling that these terrors live today, not in ancient history, as I was raised to think of slavery and much of its racist legacy, was visceral. Our visit to the nearby museum reinforced that rather than one-offs, lynchings are part of a river that runs from the past through the present, from the first slave passages in the 1690s, through the backlash to Reconstruction and Jim Crow, through deliberate redlining and segregation, through mass incarceration, to recent killings, fascist bigotry, and voting rights attacks. Like many of us, I have been thinking about race and inclusion in my role as a person with enormous privilege, but this trip was different. It crystallized that the historical lens I consciously and unconsciously apply to my everyday world is framed by the rearview mirror. Slavery happened then. Jim Crow happened then. All terrible, but in the past, something society is recovering from. This narrative belies the blatant intentionality of many instances in U.S. history where just a bit of digging reveals actions taken with direct or implied government support for the explicit, premeditated purposes of exclusion, subjugation, and acquisition. One particularly heinous example is the common, premeditated 20th century practice of distributing commemorative lynching postcards as barely veiled warnings. Per Wikipedia, they were sent legally until 1908, and the practice continued after that. If you'd asked me about lynchings until recently, I would have said they were few and far between, limited to the South, and the result of spontaneous racist rage of a relatively few KKK fanatics with no knowledge of the postcards. We saw a current example of this same system in Selma, which, unlike other national historic sites, is depressingly bleak, underserved, and underinvested. The deliberate 21st century national disregard this epitomizes reminds me I didn't hear the whole story. I inherited much of my worldview from my dad, who fled Germany alone for the US at 16. He had a profound conviction that American democratic institutions can and do work, albeit imperfectly. He would say, to paraphrase, if you don't like it here, spend some time in Nazi Germany. I was taught that our system and institutions are bulwarks against threats of a mob mentality and to define civil rights in terms of crucial but incremental adjustments to right a racist history, not a fundamental reconsideration of how we see our society or the virtual air we breathe. While I still cling to my dad's faith that our institutions are important and can be reformed, our walk through the memorial and the emotional firsthand accounts shared with us by those who fought in Selma and Birmingham in my lifetime for the right to ride a bus or eat a hot dog at a lunch counter confronted me powerfully with the sense that it's not enough to pursue social justice actions and causes. I think fundamental, uncomfortable reconsideration of the working theory we use to navigate the daily world is a precondition for action, particularly for those like me who had the luck to escape everything from the extreme trauma of slavery. We learned that at least half of all enslaved families were separated. Through to today's baked-in impediments and biases, both obvious and insidious. Some personal examples of this questioning. When looking for someone to assist at the grocery store, why do I assume they will be a person of color? And why is my first thought when a person of color tells me they're afraid each day as their young adult son leaves home that it must be hyperbole? And why is my initial reaction fear when I see a loud group of black teenagers walking toward me, more so than if the same equally loud group were white? Turning to CBE, our trip similarly strengthened my feeling that to help repair the world, we must first reflect individually and collectively about our learned worldview and challenge ourselves to consider the extent to which it is wise and moral. In writing this, I was reminded of something I recall, very likely imperfectly, from college philosophy. Socrates taught the importance of recognizing through dialogue when one's core beliefs are dissonant as a necessary first step towards finding truth. I'm sure there's a Jewish version of this, but I'm not well versed enough to know it. I tried Googling. I think a better world cannot be built solely through action, but also by continuing to engage meaningfully, intentionally, and repeatedly with each other as a community, as we did on and after our journey with Rabbi Cohen's gentle encouragement and guidance. And in doing so, to push ourselves constructively to align our worldview with our hopes, with honesty and openness and honesty about our deeply held, often hidden preconceptions and whom they benefit in both design and in practice. I'm hopeful that joining together this way will help us forge a truly inclusive shared understanding that will serve as a proud new foundation for our work building a more just community for all.
Thank you, Nick. Justine. And after Justine, we'll hear from Ben Wides.
The night after our first full day in Montgomery was hard. We had traveled from Georgia to Montgomery that morning, visited the Rosa Parks Museum, the Memorial for Peace and Justice, and EJI's Legacy Museum. It was a very long day. But it wasn't just that I was physically and emotionally exhausted. It was something more. I felt physically off, jittery, on edge, and deeply unsettled. When Lori asked me how my day had been, I ended up with tears streaming down my face. I tried, both in that moment and since then, to hold on to that unsettled feeling, to pinpoint the triggers. Of course, there is the obvious, The subject matter itself is deeply upsetting and reason enough for tears. The profound and long history of slavery, the widespread terror and lynchings, the over-incarceration and unjust treatment of Black Americans, all profound triggers for sadness. But there was something about being in those physical spaces and the physicality of the Legacy Museum in particular that affected me viscerally, as opposed to just intellectually. Standing in Court Square, the site of Montgomery's slave market, we looked down Commerce Street towards the river where human beings were marched off boats and in chains brought to be sold as slaves. Children taken from parents, brothers and sisters separated, families lost to each other forever. Standing on that same ground, I could feel more palpably the violence of those separations, the violence and degradation implicit in the sale of another human being. The opening room in the Legacy Museum is a black-walled, dark room with videos of swelling waves that made me feel as if I were on a boat, physically thrown up and down, out of control over the waves. There's then a long hallway that follows, lined by a sculpted landscape depicting human heads, chained at the necks and seemingly sunken in the sand, an art installation that gives a physical legacy to the millions who drowned in the transatlantic journey. I could feel the turbulence of the ocean and in turn the brutality of 12.7 million men, women, and children kidnapped and forced across the Atlantic. As the exhibit turned towards the slave trade, holograms of enslaved people were animated inside cages and spoke to us as if alive and real. In the section depicting the lynchings, the actual soil from the different lynching sites had been physically gathered by different people in the community and jarred and lined up on a luminous wall that was high and long. Some of it fine sand, some of it gravelly, all different colors. But the actual soil collected as if a specimen, a remnant from a burial, the only physical thing that could be gathered from sites of unspeakable violence, where human beings were hung and mutilated for supposed infractions of arbitrary and non-existent rules. But the moment when I became physically anxious was when I walked into the room on mass incarceration. Sorry, I brought a tissue because I think this might happen. And I saw that you could sit down and lift up a receiver as if you were visiting an inmate in jail. This was not a new experience to me. I am a criminal defense attorney. I spent 9 years as a public defender in federal court here in Brooklyn. And for more than 10 years, I've been in private practice, but I still do a lot of indigent defense work in all sorts of federal cases: drugs, guns, gangs, petty fraud, big fraud, immigration crimes. There's a lot. And I have spent a fair bit of time in jails, and most of the time actually in the federal detention facility here in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And seeing the video reenactments of clients in prison outfits opened up a flood of emotions for me about my own clients. For 20 years, I've represented people for whom I felt responsible and people for whom I have cared. And many of my clients are caught up in the criminal justice system after a lifetime of struggle and traumas: abject poverty, childhood abuse, addiction, and untreated mental illness. Many of that vestiges of our history of racial oppression. Jail itself is traumatizing. In prison, you are separated from your family, caged and regulated. Whatever the length of the sentence, whether deserved or not, it is fundamentally dehumanizing. While I had intellectually studied and understood the interconnectedness of the history of the criminal justice system, the physical power of the exhibits meant that I now physically felt that through line. From the vigilante lynching and the caged and chained human beings to the dehumanization and the caging of mostly black and brown men and children and women in our carceral system. Not just academically, but the brick and mortar of the Metropolitan Detention Facility in Sunset Park, the jail cells outside of federal courtrooms in downtown Manhattan. And it made me feel sick and anxious. And I wanted to say and shout, these legacies do not only exist in this southern space, in bad jails in Louisiana or underfunded public defender systems in the South. These problems are right here. Many of us, including Rabbi Timoner, were outside the MDC protesting several years ago when the facility lost power and over 1,600 human beings were left for days in the dark and cold without enough food. But while that crisis passed, the conditions there did not get better. During and since the pandemic, inmates have been on 23-hour lockdowns for months at a time, unable to see family. Lawyers have had to file lawsuits to access and visit with their clients. Healthcare has been non-existent, and for periods of time, inmates were not given enough food. The drinking water ran brown from the taps. In the federal system, profoundly unjust sentencing policies persist. Mandatory minimums for drug crimes remain on the books. For the first 2 years of the Biden administration, Merrick Garland did nothing to return to the more lenient charging practices put into place under President Obama. In fact, it was only a week after our trip to the South that a memorandum was issued, finally making clear that prosecutors should treat crack cocaine the same as powder for purposes of sentencing. All of this and so much more came jumbling up for me in that dark museumed room about people in prison. I turned and stumbled from that room with some relief to the last room in the exhibit that they call the reflection space. It's a high-ceilinged room that's bathed in golden light and with peach hues. The walls are hung with inspiring images of civil rights heroes, advocates who had the courage to fight for change. I remember music playing. I'm not sure if it was, but I remember music. And I sunk into the soft couch and I cried into my mask. I was joined by Rabbi Colin, who cried with me. While there was physical pain in this experience, in this journey, there was also physical comfort and even physical joy. I'm grateful that we could see and hold each other's pain. I'm grateful to my fellow congregants and friends for the chatter and laughter on the bus. Said it was the Jewish camp experience I never had. About children, careers, aging parents, and the passage of time. I'm particularly grateful for the impromptu dance party at the Mexican restaurant on the very last night. There may or may not have been margaritas involved. Our bodies needed to move and needed to dance. And I'm grateful for being forced to process, for this exercise to process the experience. I hope that I will continue to process it. I have much more learning to do. Cast by Elizabeth Wilkerson, a book I've long meant to read, sits now on my bedside table. But beyond the studying, I know that it is important for me to come back again and again to the physical memory of the violence, the brutality and the cruelty of racism. The power of the museum for me is that it made the historical through line of racial trauma and violence not just something you could understand, but something that I could feel. And it is that feeling that I want to carry with me in the days and the months ahead in my work, and in my life, and in my community. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Ben.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I wish I'd printed this out. There is a room at the EJI Legacy Museum depicting the internal domestic slave trade in the United States, when the combination of Congress outlawing the transatlantic slave trade and the boom in cotton production in the early 19th century meant plantation owners in the Upper South could make a fortune from the forced sale and relocation of up to 1 million black people to the Lower South, a process that broke apart hundreds of thousands of families in a few generations. I watched a historical reenactment video of a man losing first his wife and then his daughter in this process. That was the first time I cried on our trip. At the Memorial for Peace and Justice, aka the Lynching Memorial, there is a separate area with row upon row of weathered stencils for the large plaques that EJI has created to document and memorialize the victims of specific lynchings. The plaques tell detailed stories of men and women, old and young, many of them formerly enslaved, murdered in the decades after emancipation for asserting their humanity, whether by amassing property or starting a successful business or voting or demanding fair wages or resisting sexual violence or in some other way affirming that emancipation meant not bowing to a new racial caste system. The generations depicted in these plaques are the descendants of the generations that endured the domestic slave trade, or perhaps even some of the same people. In Selma, we met with a descendant of that post-emancipation generation, Joanne Bland, a grandmother, civil rights activist, and champion of Selma's community, who marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. As a child, Joanne said she understood freedom to mean she'd finally be able to eat the ice cream at the segregated pharmacy. She spoke of her grandmother attending organizing meetings about voting rights, and then how she began to attend organizing meetings as a middle school student. On Bloody Sunday, Joanne marched with SNCC's John Lewis and Hosea Williams and experienced the violence of the Alabama state troopers firsthand. Her older sister, author Linda Lowry, was beaten unconscious. Joanne started her tour with us at the George Washington Carver Homes, the low-rise public housing community where she and many of the foot soldiers of the Selma Voting Rights Campaign grew up, and where many Selma residents continue to live. The march over the Pettus Bridge was organized at the church in that community. It began right there. And as Joanne explained, troopers pursued the marchers all the way back to that community and beat them there, within sight of their own homes. Today, there is only a dilapidated playground for the children at the Carver homes because the Selma community has become so disinvested. And I recognize in that disinvestment the causes of the mass incarceration crisis, so vividly spotlighted by EJI, that remains another legacy of the violence done to black communities. I think one of my takeaways from this trip is how difficult it is to truly wrap our heads around the scope and magnitude of the history of anti-black violence and injustice in this country. I mean, to really be able to see in its entirety, all at once, the terrible violence, injustice, and dehumanization against black people endured by generation after generation after generation for 400 years. How do you capture it? I couldn't even read all the plaques at the memorial. I am a history teacher. I've taught much of this American history. But when I teach it, I realize that it is in parts. Slavery here, lynching there, Jim Crow there, redlining there, civil rights battles there, criminal justice there. Being able to comprehend this history as one gigantic lived experience, one story, connecting across generations of people in its entirety, all at once, a history that is not ended, that is both past and present, seems almost impossible because it is so immensely vast and the thread of connection so long. Like staring at the horizon and trying to register that the world is round, but we can only see one flat plane at a time. Whether it was the genius of the Memorial for Peace and Justice, the incredibly unyielding and visceral comprehensiveness of the Legacy Museum, or just the constant proximity of the legacy of racial violence that pervaded every destination, being immersed in this history for 3 days is the closest I think I've come to being able to see the curvature of the planet, so to speak. Unfortunately, I think this very vastness obscures this history for most white Americans. I think the vastness itself is in fact an obstacle to our reconciling with it and addressing its very real legacies today. As a society, it is difficult to fully reconcile with something we have difficulty seeing in its entirety, especially in a climate where many are actively working to deny this history. So I commit to seeing the full scope, and I have to be vigilant that others see it too. And finally, this trip also brought home, in deeply moving ways, the equally vast history and legacy of incredible courage shown by generation after generation after generation of Black Americans to risk extreme violence or whatever material security they had, to assert their humanity and their equality, and to resist, right down to the Sunday morning we spent at Ebenezer Baptist Church celebrating the electoral victory of Reverend Raphael Warnock. It is so important to fully recognize and to teach the immense scope of that resistance, grounded in faith and courageous hope for a better future. Because that resistance, that faith, that hope provides the inspiration needed to confront the legacy of violence and racism today. It means seeing anti-racism today as part of that long story of resistance. And it means recommitting to my place in that struggle. Thank you.
I just want to deeply thank the 4 people who shared their profound reflections. And all those who had the courage to go on this trip. I am grateful to all of you for bringing the stories back to us. Clearly, we're going to have to do this trip again. I bet everybody else in this room is thinking, when can I go? And a few things. I think that it's possible when we do get a glimpse of the magnitude that you're talking about, Ben, and the physical pain that you were talking about, Justine. And when we get a glimpse of it, there's a way that it could make us despair or feel defeated or feel like it's just too big or feel like it's just too painful. And so sometimes we just look away. We don't want to go on this trip, or we don't want to look at the MDC right here, or we don't want to look at what's actually happening all around us because it feels too big and too painful. And then sometimes when we do get that glimpse, it maybe even more feels like, what can I do? And Bobby said, she's part of the Dismantling Racism Team advocacy group here. And several other people talked about things that they do, whether it's teaching history or defending people. There is a way that every one of us, wherever we stand, whoever we are, whatever our particular skills are, whatever our particular job is, whatever, there is a way for every one of us to participate. And it is essential that we not allow ourselves to be defeated or to despair. I think maybe Mick said that. And so the question is, what are you going to do? And here at CBE, we have 3 paths that are currently in existence. We have the Dismantling Racism team, which has been working for now maybe 6 years on specific campaigns in New York to change the laws and the policies in the criminal legal system. We have our anti-racism work, which has been about making CBE an anti-racist congregation, recognizing the full diversity of the Jewish people, welcoming Jews of color and people of color, and making this a space that is truly anti-racist for all people. And then there is our partnership with Antioch Baptist Church, in which we are partnering with a Black church in conversation about racism and anti-Semitism, and thinking about what can we do together to change the realities in Brooklyn. So 3 things right here that you can do. You don't have to do one of those, but those are available here. And in this week's Parsha, I mentioned before, we have the beginning of our story of slavery and liberation. And there's this moment that everybody knows is, if you don't, it's okay, but where Shifra and Puah, the midwives, are ordered by Pharaoh to murder the baby boys of the Israelites. And they resist, risking their lives. And one of the things that I was reminded this year when I was studying this part of the Parsha is that the word crisis, mashber, is the same word as birthing stool. And so when it seems impossible, when it seems like an insurmountable crisis, when it seems like it will never change, something new is always being born. Always. And the question is, are we going to resist Pharaoh and help the future be born? Or are we going to feel like it's just too big of a crisis and there's nothing I can do? And I hope that for all of us, it will be the former. Dr. King said very famously, not digging deep here in the land of the quotes, these are, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So we sang before this little light of mine, and I can tell it's getting started up again. And we could sing this, as I think probably we've all done at some point, as just a little sing-along song. Feels good, we know it. But this time, let's sing it in a way of saying, okay, I've got a certain amount of light. How am I going to add my light to drive out this darkness? Really?
Even in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Even in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Even in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, this little light of mine, I'm This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
It is upon us. Aleinu, page 586, we rise.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגור עלינו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. כי המלכות שלך היא ולעולם מעד תמלוך בכבוד, ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
You may be seated.
Shabbat Shalom. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you all here tonight. It's been an incredibly special evening. As always, I want to thank our clergy. Thank you, Rabbi Timoner, Cantoral Intern Jordan Goldstein for leading us. I want to thank Nate Jeff, who's staring at me down the hall, for supporting us in person. And I want to thank Anton Smelov. Thank you for providing audio and online support. Before I get to the last, I just want to thank, of course, Bobby and Mick and Justine and Ben. Terry and I, my wife, were on the trip, and that was, you all spoke incredibly well, and the amount of time and effort you all put in was incredible. And I just think it speaks to the community that we all participate in, that we can ask for our congregants to come speak, and you don't come up here for 30 seconds, but you come in and speak from your heart. And the amount of time and effort, I just want to acknowledge that. And I want to thank Rabbi Colin for leading us, but also for choosing so wisely. You had 35 choices, as you said, but I think you chose the best 4 you could have chosen. So I wanted to thank you for that as well. So thank you all. To finish, please join us for Kiddush and Motzi in the lobby. For those of you here for dinner, it will follow the blessings in the main social hall. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, John. And I want to just give one announcement, which is that on Sunday morning, we're going to be at Antioch Baptist Church. We're invited 10 a.m. for their service in honor of Dr. King's legacy, and it's going to be a service in his words. So everyone's invited to be there at Antioch Baptist Church in Bed-Stuy. We always conclude by thinking about people who are no longer here in the world, people we love whom we've lost. By going into the realm of memory, we certainly talked a lot about people who are no longer here in the world, and perhaps just we can agree collectively as we say Kaddish Tonight we're saying Kaddish for all those murdered by slavery and its legacy in this country, all of the forms of institutional racism that has murdered people over our history. But if you are personally mourning, if you're in Shiva, I invite you to rise and tell us who you're remembering. And if you're in Shloshim, please go ahead. Okay, if you're in Shloshim, if you're in the first 30 days since the death of a loved one, I invite you to rise and tell us who you're remembering. And if this is Shana for you, if you're in the first year since the death of a loved one, I invite you to rise and tell us who you're remembering. And if this is a yard site for you, the anniversary of a death, I invite you to rise and tell us who you're remembering. We all rise in company with the mourners in our midst. As we remember these recent losses in our congregational community. Shirley Berman, aunt of Rob Brown. Adele Wasco, mother of Bob Wasco and mother-in-law of Sue Wasco. Howard Welsh, husband of Sylvia Welsh, father of Rebecca Welsh and Jennifer Welsh-Kupnick, father-in-law of Matt Harrigan and Ben Zupnick, and grandfather of Henry and Jane. Alvin Ashley, father of Mitchell Ashley and mother-in-law of Maria Ashley. I just want to acknowledge that Jonathan Spears' grandmother, Anita, died in her funeral. It has not yet happened. We're thinking about Jonathan on this Shabbat. These yard sites, Jacob Barr, Joseph Bacharach, Shirley Bernay, Lila Bernstein, Wilma Beeler, Michael Brudo, Lena Kristenfeld, Martha Cohn, Amy Cooperstein, Ellen Dobro, Anna Ice, Ursula Earlbaum, Evangeline Fernandez, Arabelle Feinberg, Sylvia Wolfson-Fried, Celia Gleiberman, Jenny Glick, Elias Goldberg, Samuel Edward Goldberg, Fanny Goldstein, Leonard Golliber, Shelley Gottheim, Hermia Gould, Sheila Green, Miriam Greenberg, Milton Hamburger, Harry Harris, Miriam Heimberger, Irving Hurwitz, Beatrice Imberman, William Kappelmaster, Marvin Kochman, Rachel Lair, Jeanette Levin, Judith Levitt, Philip Lustig, Olive Marsh, Sarah Lillian May, Pauline May, Frederick May, Esther Mendelson, Felix Metzger, Claudia Mori, David Nachmius, Daniel Newman, Betsy Nias, Madeline Paul, Richard Posen, Phyllis Roberts, Regina Leah Rosenfeld, Edward Russlin, Lena Rubin, Jacob Runsdorf, Henry Saffer, Samuel Sanders, Phyllis Sanderson, Martin Shear, Rosa Shea, Adolph Schiff, Ray Schiff, Victor Schneider, Nancy Schwartz Sternoff, Lila Silverstein, Leah Singer, Oscar Spatz, Jim Sponsler, Emily Metger Strauss, Phyllis Sussman, Adina Talvi Goodman, Theodore Tannenhaus, Yehuda Vardy, Florence Sassuli Weiner, Morris Wolberg, Frederick Yokel. Holding them all together, we say Zichronam Livracha, may their memories be an everlasting blessing, as we turn to the words of the mourner's Kaddish on page 598. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Be'alma divrach hirute v'yamlich machute. B'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei l'chol Beit Yisrael. B'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mivarach le'alam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal Shmei t'kudesha brichu. Le'ela minko birchata v'shirata, tush birchata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru, amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, ve'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. May the maker of peace make peace for all who mourn. We say together, amen.
Oh, say shalom bimroma. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Oh, say shalom bimroma. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Oh, say shalom bimroma. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen.
Shabbat shalom. We'll continue with Kiddush in the lobby. Shabbat shalom, everyone.